Hi everybody, and welcome to Lesson 2 of our Bible study From Pit to Palace, the story of Joseph. I'm Pastor Schoen, pastor here at Word of Life Lutheran Church, and I am super excited about this lesson. I have got some content for you today to help make you not just smarter by putting some context to the story of the life of Joseph, but also a lot of interesting things to ponder, to think about as far as your own spiritual growth. So we want to take the time to have prayer as we open, but we want to get right to it because I got a lot of stuff for you, and I want you to be able to understand more fully as we continue on with this lesson, the story of Joseph. So would you pray with me, please? Lord God, Heavenly Father, we give you thanks this day as we continue this study and we continue thinking about one of those who was instrumental in the way in which you prepared your people to receive the blessing of the land of Israel. And so, Heavenly Father, we just pray that over these next number of minutes that we have this Bible study, that you would be with us and open our hearts, but also open our minds to think about these things so that all might be glorifying to you and enriching to us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. As a quick reminder, if you were not able to see Session 1 we talked about the beginning story or the beginning part of the story of Joseph, where Joseph, as a 17-year-old, had a number of brothers who were significantly older than him, and we don't know exactly how old they were, but he had a couple of dreams, and in his youthfulness, in his naivete, as we talked about last week, possibly even there was a little bit of struggle and maybe a little bit of angst and a little bit of spite in kind of the way that he told not just his brothers but also his dad about these two dreams that God had given to him. They didn't take too kindly to these dreams, which basically said that Joseph was going to, at some point in time, lord over them or be ruler over them. And his dad understood this, and his brothers, it wasn't very well disguised in the way that he told them the dreams. They were pretty self-explanatory. And so later on, down the road, Joseph is then going to go and find his brothers. His brothers were about 65 miles away from where his dad was, and Joseph was the favored brother of, or the favored child of all his brothers, and they knew it. They saw that their dad favored him, and so that made them hate him and not really like him that much more, in addition to the dreams that he had. And so they're out tending the flocks of Jacob, his father, and so then Jacob sends Joseph to go and bring a report back of kind of all that's going on. So he travels and he's looking around for him, and he's got to go to a couple different places a long distance away. He finally finds them, but while he's coming and while they see him in the distance, they get even more and more sour and more angry about the circumstances and about thinking about the way in which he had told them his dreams. And so they conspired to kill him. One of the brothers said, "Look, he's our brother. Let's not kill him. Let's throw him into this well, and then we'll be able to say that we didn't actually kill him." So they say, okay, that's fine. So he gets closer, they get him, they chuck him into this well, and then they go and they sit down and they have some dinner. So along the way then, they find some of their distant cousins or distant relatives that happen to be traders and happen to be going down towards Egypt. So they decide that they're going, instead of leaving him there, they're just going to sell him off into slavery to some of their extended family, which in my opinion makes the whole circumstance of the situation and makes everything that much more painful and that much worse, knowing that they willingly sold him into slavery, not just to people they didn't know, but they sold him into slavery to people that they did know. And the people that received him into slavery should have known better. And as the story ended, as we talked about last week, those traders, those extended family members took Joseph down to Egypt, and they were going to sell him off down into Egypt to somebody else. And so that sets the stage for where we're at this day. And today what we're going to do is we're going to look at 2.5 chapters, and we'll kind of work through it. There's a number of interesting points, and it may seem like a lot, but there is going to be a lot that kind of, it's important as far as the context goes to go through some of these passages, but we'll be able to move a little more quickly through some of it. And as we've been doing, and as we did last week, whenever we talk about these Bible passages from Genesis and the story of Joseph, we're going to put them up on the bottom of the screen so you'll be able to follow along with them. So, Genesis chapter 39 then. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. So let's stop there, because that kind of is the connecting point between where we were and where we are now. The Ishmaelites were the extended family of Joseph and his brothers. And so Ishmael was kind of their great uncle. And so they were great, whatever that extended family kind of descendants were along the way, or the people that they kind of sold him to. The Ishmaelites then went down to Egypt. They sold him to a person named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar, there's a lot of things that we kind of think about when we see what it says about Potiphar. So it says that he is an officer of Pharaoh, that he is the captain of the guard. And Moses, we believe, is writing this many hundreds of years later. But this story has been passed down from generation to generation so that he's able to record it and so that the people of Israel know their history. And so it seems that Moses is very particular for who is going to be reading this, exactly who Potiphar is. And Moses does this elsewhere when he's writing through the first 5 books of the Bible, that he's very specific in the context. And so if he's very specific in the context, I think it's important that we think about the importance of what he's saying regarding the specificity of who Potiphar is. So not only is he an officer of Pharaoh, he's really in charge of a lot according to Pharaoh's command, or in Pharaoh's kind of control of the land of Egypt there. But it says he's a captain of the guard. And a captain of the guard, the Hebrew word there is saris, and saris also means eunuch. And so it's possibly also can be translated court official. One way or the other, there is kind of this exalted position of who Potiphar is in the story and in the life and the context of what Joseph is going through. So later on, and not necessarily in this particular part of the story and the narrative that we're going to be going through, but later on, there's somebody else that is defined as or talked about whose name is Potipharah. And Potipharah, some people and some scholars connect Potiphar here with Potipharah, and they say that maybe it just might be a different spelling, but the same person. In ancient Egyptian, the name Potiphar means he whom Ra gave. And so that is the context of who Potiphar is. He is considered to be one of the other ways that the name Potiphar it can be translated, according to the captain of the guard, can also be chief of the slaughterers. And so when it says slaughterers, some people said, well, he might be an exalted person in the sense of he might be there helping in the food preparation, slaughtering animals. But most people and most scholars believe that when it says he is chief of the slaughterers, as one of the translations of captain of the guard, or another translation of that according to his name, that he really is chief of the slaughterers, that he's really a captain of the guard, and he's really chief in doing some bad things as far as the army goes. So we're not exactly sure in all of that. But what we do know is that he had an exalted position in Pharaoh's command, and that he had enough means where he could buy Joseph as a servant or as a slave that he was going to have working in his house. Now, we believe Joseph at this time is probably somewhere still around 17 years old, 17 or 18 years old at that time, as it talked about in the previous section. Don't know exactly how much time had passed, but it probably wasn't too terribly much. And so we continue then with verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. So let's stop there again. So Potiphar sees that something's going on, that Joseph has something special about him. Now Moses records it where he says that Potiphar may have had this sense that God was blessing him. Potiphar was an Egyptian, and so chances are, if you go through the Egyptian pantheon of gods, and just like, if not more than the Greek or the Latin Roman pantheon of gods, there was a lot of gods in the land of Egypt. And this is going to play in as well later on, hundreds of years later, when the Israelites are going to be going into the Promised Land. And one of the requirements that God had for his people, and it's a very specific command that he had at that time, and a lot of people have had a lot of discussions about this later on, but one of the things that God commanded the Israelites when they went into the Promised Land, and you may be familiar with this part, and you may have your own thoughts one way or the other on it, but one of the commands that God had for his people was that they were not to tattoo themselves to the dead or for the dead. That is a very specific rite that it was done in Egypt during that time. It was one of the ways in which they worshipped the gods of Egypt, or certain gods there in Egypt. And it's kind of just this kind of overarching idea of you've got to purge. When God brought the Israelites into the land of Canaan to turn it into the land of Israel, the land that he had promised for them, he said that they got to get rid of all of the gods and all of the things that were going on in the land of Canaan at that time, because there was a lot of gods up there as well. But there was just as many, if not more, gods that they were leaving behind in the land of Egypt. Now, they had been in the land of Egypt for 400 years worth of slavery, or 400 years worth of time of slavery. That's a lot of time to be acclimated and accustomed to all of the different gods that are there in the land of Egypt. They're going to be inundated with it all the time because of their time in slavery and being part of slaves' houses and doing all of these things. They're going to get really accustomed with all of these gods, and sometimes there's going to be a blurring of the line between what is right and what is proper, and what they can and what they couldn't do. And we see that especially when the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness, and when they get into the land of Egypt, that it's really hard for them to separate themselves from the things of the past. And that's why you see in the early books of the Bible, where it talks about the Israelites wandering through the desert and going into the land of Canaan, which would become the land of Israel, that God gets so frustrated with them. And you see time and time again that Moses is talking to them. Why do you just not trust God? What is so hard for you to trust God? Or why are all of these things, why do you have so much attachment to all of these different things? It's because they've had 400 years of being a lot of what they do. Even though they were trying to, and we see this later on in the book of Exodus, and we'll talk about more in connection to the book of Exodus in a couple of chapters, but we see a lot of attachment to the land of Egypt and the things of Egypt as well. And when they went out in the Exodus, when Pharaoh finally said, all right, just get out of my land, to just go, and Exodus records, or Moses, when he's writing Exodus, records that the Israelites basically plundered the Egyptians. They took a lot of the wealth of the Egyptians on the way out. God allowed them to do that. Chances are there might have been some stuff that they took that may not have been the best things to take, and may have been things that kept them attached to the ways of the past. We see when they get to Mount Sinai, when Moses is up on Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments from God, that they're down there and they're twiddling their thumbs and they're seeing Moses up there, and he's up there and he's up there and he's up there and he's not coming back down, and they start to wonder, is Moses dead? And what are we going to do now? Now we're just here in the desert, what are we going to do? And so they start kind of having these conversations, and they go to Moses' brother Aaron, hey, we need something to worship. We need something to worship. You can, if you know the account of the Ten Commandments and the account of the golden calf, they're like, we need something to worship. We need something tangible that we can worship. And so Aaron then takes a lot of the gold that they give him and he fashions this golden calf. They have these wild, lavish parties, this kind of drunken endeavors that they use as they kind of dance around and worship what this idol is that Aaron had made for them. And a lot of that is probably stuff they learned while they were back in Egypt. So Potiphar may have had a little bit of an understanding of the God of Joseph. Joseph may have given him a little bit of a conversation about it here or there. But chances are Potiphar didn't really believe in the God that we worship, Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, the God of Christianity, the God who has created everything. Chances are Potiphar didn't really worship him, and maybe that God he assimilated into all the other gods. We don't exactly know, but he noticed that there was something different about Joseph, and so the more and more he saw and the more that God blessed Joseph, the more freedom that Joseph had in the house of Potiphar. And Potiphar, it says in the last part of these verses that Potiphar didn't worry about anything. He saw all that Joseph was able to do, and he didn't worry about putting all of this stuff in Joseph's hand. Joseph seemed to have control. Joseph seemed to really have the gift of administration and whatever else he was doing. He had tenacity. He had a sense of integrity with things. And he didn't worry about anything that he gave to Joseph. The only thing he was worried about, and a lot of kings are worried about this all of the time, is the food that he was going to take in. So he's always going to be worried. And like I said, a lot of kings are worried about people poisoning them. We see that later on in the Bible, and we know that through the course of the Middle Ages. People that had cupbearers, and they had people, the royal food taste tester for their food. So they would have somebody taste their food and make sure it wasn't poisoned before they eat it. I don't know about you, but I don't want that job. And I know probably it's a very high and exalted job back in the day. I don't want that job. You got all kinds of people trying to kill the king, kill the pharaoh, stuff like that. You never know when you're going to eat the wrong food, and it just is going to be your last day. But exalted position. Anyway, Joseph has a lot of control and a lot of brevity and a lot of latitude that Potiphar gives him in his house. Well, then, lo and behold, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." We all understand what that means. Now, in the medieval times, there was a document called the Sefer HaYashar, which is a medieval commentary on the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible. So it's written thousands of years later as a commentary on the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so it makes some observations. It has some tradition that's in there that's passed on from generation after generation after generation. Now, in this document, they list Potiphar's wife with her name Zuleika, Zuleikha. And so that's who she is supposed to be. And Dante, in the medieval time period, when he wrote his Divine Comedy, when he's writing it, he says he sees the shade of Potiphar's wife in the 8th circle of hell, which means probably pretty bad. She's done something really, really badly. Dante is then told in this Divine Comedy by another spirit that along with other perjurers, she is condemned to suffer a burning fever for all eternity. If you know the story of Potiphar's wife, if you know the story of Joseph, here's what comes next. But he refused. And this is one of the key parts of the entire passage, this entire section that we're going to be talking about. He refused and said to his master's wife, to Potiphar's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then," and this is important, this is a huge part, "how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So Joseph recognizes that in the midst of temptation, he can't do this. That it's not just a bad thing earthly, but it's a sin against God. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. He doesn't let the false gods of Egypt corrupt him. He understands that he's still accountable to the God of his fathers. I'm not going to sin against the God that I worship. I'm not going to fall into idleness and idolatry and worship these other gods. The God that I worship has this command for me. Some of these other gods in the land of Egypt, and we kind of get the sense if we go through the pantheon of Egyptian gods during that time, that probably a lot of those type of gods would have been okay with what Potiphar's wife was asking Joseph to do. But Joseph had a higher value, and he had a higher sense of purpose and priority. He had a value system that transcended what the Egyptian gods were there for and what they kind of demonstrated or what they allowed for the people, or what the people kind of attributed as far as value systems for those different gods. Joseph said, the God that I worship has a different idea of holiness than you do and what is acceptable here in Egypt. And I will be held accountable to that value system, not the value system here in the land of Egypt. I will not do this thing. No matter how much she tried, no matter how much she did, he was not going to have it. And I find this part of the passage sad. Sad from the perspective of Joseph. And I think this is important for us to think about. That one, Potiphar's wife must have done this when nobody else was there, and we'll kind of get a sense of why or how that plays out in the next couple of verses. But it sure seems like she's going to do this when nobody else is around. One, it's for plausible deniability. It's going to be his word against hers if he ever goes to Potiphar and says, hey, your wife's been trying to do this thing to me, and she's really aggressive, trying to seduce me, and I don't know how else to tell you, but it's really weighing down heavily upon me. Joseph knows he can't do that. He knows that Potiphar has made him so high up in the food chain in his household that it's a lose-lose situation if he were to ever approach that. So he's got to sit on that, and he's got to keep his mouth shut, and he can't confide in anybody else because he's different. He's not Egyptian. He's not part of that culture. He just has to accept and try to not succumb to the temptation and make sure that nothing happens. And I think this is important for us when we think about the concept of temptation, that we need to pray for God's protection when somebody is trying to get us to fall into sin and to do something. We must pray that that temptation is put away from us, especially if we think that that situation is a lose-lose type of situation. We need to pray that God would protect us and keep us holy in those times. And it kind of falls into place in the same way if somebody asks you to keep secrets, and you know that when somebody confides in you with a secret and it seems like it's kind of a lose-lose situation, just pray to God that He protects you in the midst of that. Because a lot of times if somebody confides in us a particular secret and it's about somebody else or somebody else's circumstances or situation, and that other person finds out about it, there's going to be a sense of bitterness. There's going to be a sense of resentment. And we know we can't break confidence with the person who confided in us, but we understand the way that the other person must feel that this secret is being kept from. And none of those situations, none of those circumstances are places that we want to be put in. And so we must pray to God to help us during those times. And we must ask God in His counsel, His wise counsel, to figure out what the best way to approach all of this is and what is the best thing that we can do to create a favorable outcome in the midst of all that we have been given with that kind of information. So that's where Joseph's at. He's at a point where Potiphar's wife is trying to pursue him, to seduce him, And he's trying to stay holy, he's trying to stay pure, and he's trying to do the right thing so that he can stay and do the right thing in his master's, Potiphar's house. And I think that's part of the reason that Moses records it this way, that he calls Potiphar Joseph's master, kind of this master and servant, master and slave mentality, and just this kind of hierarchy. And kind of, even though Joseph is put in this high exalted position, there's still master and there's still servant and there's still that divide. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. Sure seems like at the time of Jesus, we know, at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, that one of the disciples, when the crowd and the mob showed up to arrest Jesus, that one of the disciples fled out of his clothes, basically fled naked away so that he could escape. It sure kind of seems like that this is the concept of what we're talking about as far as Joseph goes, that she's tugging on his uniform, his tunic, his garment, whatever it might be, and that basically it might be an outer garment. He might have had something on under it, but it was something that was specifically his. And chances are it was pretty much the only garment he was wearing. It's pretty much kind of the concept that we get. And so he's got to go and get something else on, but the outfit that he's wearing, it's very much his, and everybody knows that it's his. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of the household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us." I'm going to get back to that word Hebrew in a second, because I think it's something important that we need to talk about. He has brought, and this is Potiphar, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, until his master, Joseph's master, came home. She told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant who you have brought among us came into me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." She seems to have done this, as I said before, when she was pursuing Joseph time and time again, when nobody was around, so that it was basically a he said, she said, and she's Potiphar's wife. She's his wife, so nobody's going to question her. The guilt is, and the blame is always going to fall on the slave, on the servant, and that's always going to fall on Joseph, no matter how highly exalted he is in the household of Potiphar. But it's interesting. This is, in this section here, where it uses the word Hebrew twice, that's only the second and the third time in the Bible up to this point that the word Hebrew is used. The first instance of the word Hebrew is actually in Genesis chapter 14, where Abraham, now at the time his name was Abram, God had not yet changed his name to Abraham, but he is identified as Abram the Hebrew. A lot of people and a lot of scholars have kind of questioned where this word Hebrew came from, or the origin, etymology of the word Hebrew. Now, at the time in the land of Canaan, and there's all this different speculation, and there's a lot of different cultures, but there's a number of documents that we have from the second millennium BC, so from 1000 to 2000 BC. There's a lot of documents, especially in the earlier part of that millennium, so closer to 1800, 1900 BC. We've got a lot of documents that we have found, tons and tons of documents that talk about this group of people that were called the Hapiru, or in Akkadian, in the Akkadian language at the time, it's kind of just a similar dialect, but they're called the Habiru. And a lot of people think that the word Hebrew comes from this word Hapiru or Habiru. And the Hapiru are discussed as, and they were considered a nomadic people in the land of Canaan at that time, that they had no common ethnic affiliation. They had kind of no common language. The Hapiru, or the Habiru, as it's said in Akkadian, were considered a social class found in ancient Near East society, that they were found in kind of every culture, that the Hapiru, or possibly the Hebrews at that time, were just kind of in every culture, that there was a little bit here, a little bit there. And what it says is some of these ancient texts that we have, they're described as a special status of people who were variously described as rebels, outlaws, raiders, mercenaries, bowmen, servants, slaves, and laborers. So kind of that's a big wide description of who this Hebrew people or Habiru people might have been thousands and thousands of years ago. There was a lot of different things that they did, but they were kind of known as this outcast or outside of the fringe of society group of people. And this group of letters that were found a few hundred years ago, called the Amarna letters, they talk about, and their dialogue or discourse between lesser kings in the land of Canaan and some of the people in Egypt, especially some of the higher-ups in Pharaoh's court. These documents describe a lot of the trade and a lot of things that are going on between Egypt and the land of Canaan at that time. Well, they talk about this Hapiru people, and they specifically, in one of them, or in a group of them, talk about a certain group of this Hapiru rebelling against the Pharaoh. So we might see that they're talking, and a lot of people speculate that this is the time later on when we get to the Exodus, that they have risen up against the Pharaoh, and this is when they leave Egypt and go and pursue to go back to the land of Canaan. So it seems when a lot of people are talking about this Hapiru people, and the word itself means kind of migrant, or it means to traverse or pass over. Now, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, we call that the Septuagint, kind of echoes this idea that the word Hebrew kind of means one who is a migrant or one who is passed over or transversed from one place to another. So it translates it as this word parates, which means one who came across or a migrant. So it seems like this idea of Hebrew or the Hebrew people are this nomadic group of people that are part of, and some people think that they're part of every group or they're part of every culture that's in the area at that time. Other people say no, they're more specialized. But one way or the other, they're kind of seen as outcast. And it's interesting, Potiphar's wife, whether she understands that he is a descendant of Abraham, and Abraham is defined as a Hebrew, and maybe Abraham is defined as a Hebrew as one of this outcast or fringe society type of people, but she seems to use this in a kind of a derogatory term, where she's like, this Hebrew, this migrant, this person who has no culture, this person who is a slave, a servant, does in all of the raider, an outlaw, outcast, mercenary, rebel, all of these different ways in which the word Hapiru or Habiru or Hebrew person is defined. She's using it as a way to slander him and a way to demean him before Potiphar in order to set herself up. This common guy, this slave, this kind of fringe society type person, this guy with no class, this guy with no morals, this guy doesn't have our value system. He tried to pursue me, and he tried to come in here and disrespect you by taking advantage of me. And I think that's very important to the concept, and we're going to see the word Hebrew get used. And Moses, later on in just a few chapters when we get into the book of Exodus, we're going to see Moses take this to another level. And he's really going to start to make the connection, especially in Exodus chapter 1 and Exodus chapter 2. He's really going to set the stage for this connection between Joseph, his brothers, and the descendants of Abraham and the Hebrew people, the Israelites, and the Hebrew people. There's going to be this big connection there in the land of Egypt, kind of bringing them together as a people or as a nation. And so it's already starting to build here. We're going to start to see this word Hebrew more and more and more. And in today's world, we think of the Hebrew people in terms of the Jewish people, especially those living in the land of Israel, the Jewish state in the land of Israel at this time. But there are some places and some cultures where they didn't ever make that transition to kind of synonymously putting Hebrew and Jewish person together, especially later on in the Old Testament when we get past the Babylonian exile and you start to see Judaism as a culture and as a religious understanding, interpretation of the Old Testament kind of getting shape and becoming more and more defined. You start to see that way being synonymous with them. There's some cultures today where that synonym never came into play. And so even in some cultures, in some places today, the Jewish people aren't referred to as Jewish people. They're still referred to as the Hebrew people. And as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph. Remember back to being with Joseph in Potiphar's house, in prison. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made succeed. So you're starting to see an overlap here. The same thing that happened in Potiphar's house, according to the will of God, was happening to Joseph while he was in prison. And we're going to see in these next number of verses, when we start to circle back to more dreams that are kind of a piggyback off of what we talked about last week and kind of the continuation of the central theme of Joseph's journey is kind of his dream emphasis, or the emphasis on dreams in his life. We're going to start to see that while he's in prison, this isn't a normal type of prison. Now, it says it's the prison kind of in his house or in the Pharaoh's house. It's kind of Pharaoh's prison. So we don't know exactly how it goes. But it sure seems, and it depends on the translation that you see here. But some of the translations talk about this as him being more in custody. Some think it's more him in a legit type of prison. But because of his freedom to move around and to have a little bit more freedom than we would normally think about for people who are in prison of Pharaoh, which it seems like that's going to be the worst of the worst type of prison. Some people and some translations have equated this more of to him being maybe under house arrest as opposed to being in like the deep, dark dungeon that we think about when we think about medieval torture dungeons and things like that in a castle somewhere in England or France or things like that. So we're not exactly sure, according to this, exactly how he was in prison, but he may have been had a little more freedom than our house arrest, although it's weird to kind of think about that because of the nature of the sin that was that he had committed, or that supposedly he had committed in the sight of Potiphar and some of the other people who were been in Pharaoh's prison. But the Lord was with him and he had a little bit more freedom. Just like in Potiphar's house, Joseph is going to have the opportunity to have a lot more freedom. And just like in Potiphar's house, where Potiphar really didn't worry about what Joseph had or what was given to him or the charge that he had, the head of the jail, the head of the prison there, really didn't seem to care too much about what Joseph did because the Lord was with him and he seemed to have tenacity and he seemed to have a sense of conviction and integrity. They didn't worry too much about it. Seems a little strange, but that's the plan of God for Joseph. We move into chapter 40 now. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt, and we talk about the cupbearer, kind of the king's food taste tester, the cupbearer kind of did the same thing, making sure that he would take a drink before the king would to make sure that somebody wasn't poisoning the king. The cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense. Now, the original language in Hebrew, I'm not sure why they translate it as offense here, because there's a number of it's kind of a 50-50 when I was looking through all these different translations. Some of them say he committed an offense, but the more literal translation of this is that that the cupbearer and the baker, they sinned against Pharaoh, that they did something bad. They sinned or committed an offense against their Lord, the king of Egypt. Remember, Moses writing this is really setting up Pharaoh as this king or as this master. And when he says the Lord, the king, their Lord, the king of Egypt. So he's really trying to play up. And we're going to talk about this later on. I think this for a reason, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. So he's going to put them in the custody of Potiphar then, in the prison where Joseph was confined. So they're going to be in the same place. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended to them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream. And each dream was its own interpretation. So Moses is setting up this stage. He's got firsthand knowledge because he grew up in the household of the Pharaoh. If you know the story of Exodus chapter 1 and 2 and kind of going into what is going to happen later on in the book of Exodus. But Moses was raised along with Pharaoh, kind of in Pharaoh's house. So he's got a great understanding of all those years, or because of all those years of being with Pharaoh. And so it's going to set the stage for what's going to happen. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So it's interesting that Joseph said this, and I think this is huge when Joseph is saying this. Is he doing this from an evangelistic perspective to try to get them to think about who God is, the God that he worships? Or is when Moses writing this, is it more of something for us, the reader, down the road to think about? That Joseph might have said this to the cupbearer and to the baker, and they might have just said, yeah, sure, whatever, God, one of the gods of Egypt, blah, blah, blah. And they might not have really thought much of it in the grand scheme of things being Egyptian. But it's possible, and I think it's possible that Moses wrote it from this perspective and said it this way for us and for our benefit later as we think about and we talk about the story of Joseph, that we're going to look towards God, the God that we worship, as the one who gives us the interpretation. And Joseph, according to Moses, is going to receive his revelation not of his own will and not of his own interpretation, but of God. Moses' writing seems that he says the dreams belong to God, not just the interpretation. He said that, and we thought about that in last lesson. We think about it in this lesson as well. Both the dream and the interpretation then are going to belong to God. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. And think about 3 days, Jesus being restored. So God brings a lot of things together in the Bible, even though Jesus isn't specifically mentioned here. This 3-day restoration, all the way back into Genesis, God is already setting the stage for when we think about the number 3 and we think about the concept of being restored. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. The cupbearer is kind of like Christ. And the cupbearer is kind of like, and his job kind of like what Jesus is going to do. The cupbearer made sure that there was no poison or anything that was going to poison Pharaoh. Jesus then is kind of like that cupbearer. So he keeps the wrath of God, the cup of wrath, away from you and me. And through his death and through his resurrection and through his being restored on the 3rd day, we get a chance to see that the wrath of God has been pushed away, that Jesus drank that cup. He drank the cup of wrath for you and for me so that we might have life and we might have salvation. It's great how God brings all of these things together and brings all of these messages together, even in from an Old Testament context and an Old Testament understanding, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus is even born into this world. God is preparing the way for us to see all of this foreshadowing of the life, the death, the resurrection, and the hope that we have in our Lord Jesus Christ. And Joseph, it says this to the cupbearer. He said, you're going to be restored. Pharaoh in just a few days is going to restore you. I just ask you this one thing, please. Mention me to your master. Remember me. Mention it to Pharaoh. I've done nothing wrong that I should be in this circumstance. I should be in this place. And when Jesus is drinking the cup of wrath, all we can ask is that Jesus talk to the Father, talk to God, our Heavenly Father, on our behalf. We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be in this pit. You have taken this wrath upon yourself. We might have life. And you see a lot of these similarities. And you think about the thief on the cross. Remember me, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus responds, today you will be with me in paradise. Though we have done things that we should be in the pit, that we should be cast out of the kingdom of God because of our sin, Jesus makes sure that he took that cup of wrath and he drank that cup of wrath, that we don't have to worry about the wrath of God falling upon us because we believe and we put our trust in Jesus. And this is just a great way to think about it. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, so when the baker saw that Joseph had interpreted the cupbearer's dream well and given him a favorable response, he said to Joseph, okay, hey, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. So Joseph is going to immediately then say to him, I've got an interpretation for you. The 3 baskets, 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you. So it's not going to be the same type of lifting up. He's going to lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree. And the birds will eat the flesh from you. Ugh. How devastating that must have been to the baker when the cupbearer just got this great message, hey, you're going to be restored. Baker, no, you're going to die. Must have been great fun. And I find that interesting when I think about the nature of how both of them must have felt for those next 3 days, having heard the message already and already knowing the outcome and wondering how is that all going to play out. So and here it goes. Here's the last couple of verses of this chapter. On the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. So it seems the way that Moses writes this, that at first Pharaoh exalts or restores both the cupbearer and the baker. He exalts them, lifted up the head of them. He restores them. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. So he was pleased with what the cupbearer did. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And this begs the question, I wonder about this. And I have wondered about this as I've been studying through this. And you see things when you're reading through it, and I've read through this story. I can't tell you how many times, never really thought about it, but I'm wondering this now as I was thinking through this, and I want you guys to think about this as well. Think about it from the baker's perspective. The cupbearer probably is going through this like, it's all good. I'm good. In a couple of days, I'm going to be restored. I'm going to get out of this prison, and it's all going to be good. The baker must have been sweating through and wondering how things were going to go. Is this really going to happen? But I wonder, the way according to the way that it's written, I really, really wonder if Pharaoh had lifted up the cupbearer and the baker and kind of restored them, kind of recanted on where and what he was going to do to them. But somehow, something in the back of the baker's mind just couldn't get over that something was going to happen. And maybe he was groveling, maybe he did something, maybe he did this, maybe he did that, and he's begging Pharaoh. Maybe he did something that really angered Pharaoh. And this became a self-fulfilling prophecy to the point that Pharaoh got so angry, he said, you know what? And then he kills him anyway. I really wonder, according to the way that it's written, if maybe he was at some point restored, but he just couldn't take it, and he thought for sure something, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy for him, according to the plan of God. We move into chapter 41 then, and here becomes a huge part of the text. After 2 whole years, so this is 2 whole years that Joseph then has been in this prison. After how many years or how long of a period of time, we're not exactly sure. He's been in Potiphar's house and all of these things. We're probably sure Potiphar's wife probably wasn't going after a 17-year-old at the time. So it's probably been 3, 4, 5 years or so, 6, 7 years maybe, that he was in Potiphar's house. Maybe a little bit longer. We're not exactly sure. But we know that later on, it's going to tell us in the next chapter, later on, that he's 30 years old. So we don't know how long it was between when the text says that he was 17 to when he was in Potiphar's house, but he's in Potiphar's house for a time, and then he's in prison there for 2 whole years. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And so Moses, and essentially how he writes this and how he's written this compared with the other couple of chapters and the other 2 dreams that the cupbearer and the baker had. In the cupbearer and the baker, we don't know the dream until they tell Joseph what the dream is. But Moses, I think, wants to separate the dream and the dreams that Pharaoh has with the cupbearer and with what the baker have, and he wants us he wants to show us that this is kind of the meat of the story, and this is the meat of this section of the story. And so he doesn't want to wait to tell us what the dream or the dreams of Pharaoh are going to be. He wants to tell us on the outset. And so here's what he said: Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed into the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So it's going to seem like it's two dreams, but they're going to get combined and it's going to be one dream. And this is kind of what Moses is trying to get us to understand, that this is one dream put together, that these two dreams are correlated together. And so notice the dichotomy and notice kind of the way, the contrast here. You've got attractive and plump cows. And then in the other dream, you've got plump and good ears of grain. You contrast that within the first part of the dream, the 7 other cows, ugly and thin, sickly. And that's going to be compared with the 7 other ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. So you're going to see this comparison, but also this contrast between the good cows, the good grain, the bad cows, and the bad grain. And you're going to see, it's interesting how this story gets passed down from generation to generation, and how Moses then records it. We also believe by the inspiration of God, but the way that he writes it is kind of interesting. The way he paints it is this contrast. So in the morning, that would be Pharaoh's spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, now that I think about it, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted it to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So apparently Pharaoh, there's enough people in the prison that Pharaoh didn't know who Joseph was or know anything about him, and did not know the favoritism, and maybe the head or the chief of the guard who was over the prison there kind of kept that hidden because he liked Joseph and didn't want Pharaoh to see that he was favoring one of the prisoners, and that might have been spelled the end or disaster for him. So it doesn't seem like Pharaoh has any idea who Joseph is, but this cupbearer says, you know what? Boy, I remember something. I'd kind of buried it, but with all this dream talk, now I remember. I had this dream along with this other guy who I was there with, the one that you hanged. But this guy Joseph was there, and he saw that we were struggling, and we didn't understand these dreams that we had. So we told him our dreams, and he interpreted them. And you know what? It was exactly as he said. I was restored. The baker was hanged. And it's exactly the way that he said. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, so he was apparently just becoming ZZ Top, Grizzly Adams type of thing, and they just kind of left him there, didn't really care about him. But now, because he was going to be presented before the Pharaoh, they're going to make sure that he is well presented. He came in before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream. This is not the same type of dream that Martin Luther King Jr. had. I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, and he answers him kind of the same way he's talking to the cupbearer and to the baker earlier on. It is not me. God will provide Pharaoh a favorable answer. And once again, as kind of we're thinking about the way he was in Potiphar's house, way he was in prison when he's talking about the nature of his relationship to the God that he worshiped versus the God of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, or the gods of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. It is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So we don't know if Pharaoh said, yeah, sure, whatsoever, one God, maybe amongst all of these other gods, whatever. He might have just had this general concept of God, not really sure what it's all about. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. And then it's interesting, here we see that Pharaoh interjects something that Moses doesn't tell us when he recounts the dream or the dreams the first time. So Pharaoh says this then, and kind of in addition to the dream, he says his own commentary on things. He said, "But when they had eaten them," this is the sickly and thin cows, "when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning." So I really wonder, when Moses is writing this, is this really stuck with him when Pharaoh, or stuck with Joseph, and Joseph passing this on to others, that they would pass this on from generation to generation after generation. If this part of it really stuck with Joseph and it got passed down this way so that they would understand Pharaoh's real struggle with this concept of these sickly, thin cows. "Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain to me." So I think when Moses is writing it this way, and as we're going to see, this dichotomy, this concept that we're going to see later on, and we're going to see especially next week when we talk about the famine, if you're familiar with the story, the good years and the famine years, this concept of famine seems to really have struck a chord and stuck with Moses when he's thinking about this. And I think that's kind of why he wrote this little interjection there from Pharaoh. "But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning." Really painting this contrast between the good, the plump and happy cows, and the sick and thin and cows that were really ugly, and the way that famine just in a lot of ways can overwhelm the good things in life, and the famines of our life, when those times, those sore spots for us to think about, those times where it seems like we're without sustenance from God, or that we think that God has forgotten us, that sometimes we remember those things more than we remember the good times. And I think psychologically for you and me, if we think about it, that's a lot of the way that we think about our lives. When we think about sometimes the good things, how much easier a lot of times is it to remember the bad things? And as much as we want to remember the good things, we really remember the bad times and the bad things that have happened. And I think maybe in part that's kind of what Moses spiritually is trying to get us to think about, or maybe God is laying upon our hearts. Are we so consumed by the bad things in our life that we forget about the good things? God is going to bring the good things into our life. And if we have a space or a time where it seems like there's a famine, and maybe that famine time has really spread, God's still going to provide through those times of famine and remind us that He has given providence over us, and He has given us the daily bread that we need, even in those times of famine. And so we're going to come out on the other side even better. And even if it's not in this life, because of Christ, because of Jesus, because of His message, we still will have the blessing of eternal life that God has waiting for us, that He has stored up in heaven for you and for me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one." So he's making this connection. God has revealed to Pharaoh what God is about to do. "The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt." Kind of what we talked about. "The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Joseph interprets the dream. It's going to be 7 good years, but then there's going to be 7 really bad years. And it's interesting, when you read through this, and as I was rereading through this, and I was thinking about this, it struck me again. Joseph says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to appoint people who are going to take 20% of what's there during the good years. That's going to sustain you or us as Egyptians during those 7 bad years. As I was thinking about that, I was thinking, wow, why 20%? Shouldn't they be saving a lot more than that? But I think one of the things that God wanted Joseph and Joseph wanted Pharaoh to understand is that this 7 years of plenty, this 7 years of abundance is going to be so filled with abundance that even 20% is going to be so much greater than you would find under even great circumstances, that it's going to be so good that 20% is going to be incredible. And it's going to be so much that it's really going to, even when we don't think about it that way, even with the worst of famines, that 20% is going to be so great that it is still going to be able to sustain. And then so you have to be shrewd. You got to take this 20%. You got to make sure this 20% parlays itself for the time over the 7 years that we have. And even though the famine's going to be bad, we're still going to be able to get through this. So it's interesting. When we think about the famine, if you know the story, sometimes we think about when there was a famine in the land of Egypt, we kind of get this sense that like all commerce and all opportunity just kind of came to a stop. That's not the case. It just meant that they needed food, that there was going to be this famine. Obviously, they're going to need food, but there's other trade, there's other commerce, so there's other things that are going to be going on in Egypt economically, but there was going to be this need for food. And even though there was this severe famine, it didn't mean that there was going to be absolutely, positively no food, no crops whatsoever. It was just going to be really, really bad, unlike they had ever seen, and there is going to need to be something that closes that gap. Now, some commentators, if you read through this, said, and they're saying about this passage that when you think about only taking 20% at the time, they said, well, this would mean that the Egyptians would more sparingly wean themselves from overabundance during those 7 years. I'm not so sure I buy that. It's possible, but I'll get to that in a minute when we get some lessons to learn from this. But it's interesting. So the question becomes, and so you want to come back as we talk about this more over the next couple of lessons, especially next week. Was this dream and this interpretation kept from the Egyptians? Or did all of the Egyptians kind of know that this was the plan and this was going to happen? Or did they just know that the leaders were taking 20% and there was a reason for it? But they didn't want the Egyptians to panic, and maybe they didn't want the word to spread to some other lands, because it's talking about we're going to see in next week's lesson that the famine is going to be more than just in the land of Egypt at that time. It's going to be in the land of Canaan and kind of throughout the known world at that time. So there's going to be this huge famine. So question becomes, did the Egyptians know about it, or was that something that was only known by a select few, some of the overseers like Pharaoh and Joseph and the other people that were there when he interpreted the dream, and those that Pharaoh told, do this and don't let anybody tell you otherwise type of thing. So I think it's something interesting to think about when we think about this. So do we have a life, do we live a life of overabundance? And that kind of plays into this idea of kind of what Joseph is talking about here, or what some of the commentators are talking about in this time of plenty, and thinking about some of the commentators saying that they think that they think the Egyptians are going to kind of temper themselves and not go about with a sense of abundance and overindulgence with all this extra that they're going to have. I'm not so sure. How often do we, according to our human nature, just when we've got overabundance, we just kind of go and live it up? We have this eat, drink, or be merry kind of mentality, as opposed to let's plan for the future, let's save, let's not go overboard. We know that so many people, and there's this temptation in our life to just go overboard when we think we've been blessed, and we think the blessing is just going to keep continuing and continuing and continuing, when we have to really kind of think about what is God's plan and what do I need to prepare for this season of famine that may come. So it's something to think about. So some other lessons, some other points to consider as we think about this part of the text, or this narrative, this part of the narrative of the life of Joseph. Going back to the beginning part, temptations as obstacles and sin. How can we do what, this is what Joseph says, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God when Potiphar's wife is chasing him? I think we need to think more fully about the temptations that we have in our life. And I think it's probably a good practice for many of us to think about the way that Joseph responds in all of this. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Maybe it would be good for us to say that out loud when we're dealing with something, or when we see some type of temptation. Are we willing to admit, should I do this because I understand that it is not just wickedness, but it is a sin against God? Maybe that might put us in check, and maybe that might cause us to rethink some of the things that we were going to do once upon a time. Temptation is big in our lives. We've got to make sure that God is greater. Temptation's big. God's got to be greater. He's got to help us through. We've got to continue to pray that God overwhelms the temptation for us and puts that temptation away, that we focus on Him and we follow Him and Him alone. We also want to think about the purpose of dreams. Are the purpose of dreams to give comfort, to warn for a message of repentance, or are they to foreshadow something down the road? And I think dreams, in the context of what we talked about today, it's kind of a little bit of all of these things. That sometimes dreams are meant to give us comfort about where God is in our lives. Sometimes dreams are meant to be a wake-up call, something we need to think about what's going on in our life or our circumstances. Sometimes it's there, God's going to give it to foreshadow, to prophecy, something that's really going to happen. So it all just goes back to, how did knowing the interpretation of their dreams affect the cupbearer and baker differently? Joseph told them what was going to happen. How did they let that affect them? And when we have certain dreams, it's good to pay attention to some of what might be going on. Whether you think the dreams are a manifestation of our psyche, or a manifestation of kind of what we're going through, or you think that dreams come from God, one way or another, they should give us introspection. We believe dreams come from God, and that according to these passages, that we need to be careful with what we do with our dreams, and what it means for us in the context of our lives and our circumstances. And the third point comes from the last section here, where Joseph says that God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. So God shows what He is going to do. He has shown us what He's going to do. What are we going to do as a result? Will we follow? Will we learn from these things as God has laid them out for us and He has prepared for us during certain times in our lives? Or are we just going to completely disregard it, keep doing what we're doing, staying in the same place and the same things that we're doing? Are we going to listen to God's word? Are we going to listen to Him speaking to us? Are we going to allow His word to change us, mold us, shape us for something greater than maybe succumbing to temptation and the wickedness of sin? God has so many great things in store for you. And I just pray that this lesson has helped you think about that. Not just helped you learn a little bit more about the context of where Joseph was at during that time and some of the surrounding circumstances in his story, but it helps you understand your life and some of the things that God is doing and working in your life as we speak, and some of the things that He's preparing you for down the road. Is there a time of great plenty? Time of great famine? Where have you seen the times of plenty? Where have you seen the times of famine? Have you paid attention? How has it helped your faith? May God be with you as you think through those things, and we'll see you next week.